Thank you for joining us. This is Brave New History. We're here with Robbie, Tulip. How are you doing?
Hi, Elliot. I'm really well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for coming. And we're talking about the Christmas story in the stars.
That's right.
So what do we know about the Christmas story in the stars?
Right. Well, so I've been a student of astrotheology for many years. And as you know, I live in Australia. And so I have a different view of the stars from people in the northern latitudes in the US and Europe. And so I grew up learning to watch the stars, looking at the stars, especially with my mum. She was just a keen astronomer, and so it just led me to my own interpretations. And as I studied these interpretations, I found ideas that I think have got a really good present a really good hypothesis about how the stories originated. So I'll share a PowerPoint, and I think if I hit present, that's it, isn't it? So if I present share screen, and okay, I hit share screen, and then I'll just check which screen I need to share. And sorry about this. It's I'm used to doing this on. Okay, sorry. There we are. Okay, here we are. Now, this is a picture of the sky from Jerusalem on the conventional date that was believed, according to the mythology, to be the birth time of Jesus, the Christmas day in 1 BC. Of course, there's no year zero. I've put this in Jerusalem, much the same in Bethlehem. And I'll just start off by reading the well-known biblical text. Would have been nice if we'd done this a couple of weeks ago, but at the time when everyone was thinking about all of these beautiful old stories. But here we are. So from the pilgrimage of the Magi, from the chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east," or as it rose, "and have come to worship him." The star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with great delight. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. So everyone knows this story, and there's all sorts of interpretations about what it could possibly mean. You know, like, for example, was the star the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn? Well, I've got an interpretation which I think is the correct one, and so I'll share that with you now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to another screen. Now, can you see this different screen, Elliot?
No, maybe we could.
Well, I'll stop sharing and then start again. Yep. And so let's see. So I come back here and I hit present and I hit share screen, and then it comes up to window and I click on that window and I hit share. Okay, here we are. Now, this is using a program which is called Skygazer 4.5, which is an astronomy program. And what I've done here is that same diagram roughly that we saw before, but here we're at Bethlehem and we're on Christmas Day on 4 BC. And the time here is, where is it? 1943. So that's about, anyway, it's at dusk, 7 p.m. So this is the sky, if we can imagine being there with Joseph and Mary in the manger and let's see what comes up as we start moving. I've done it so that we can just and here we have the east and the and this is the meridian. So the stars are going to rise in the east. Now, what we've seen here is immediately at dusk on Christmas Day, we see these three stars, the belt of Orion, of course, which are rising in the east, and they're headed for the west. So headed for the west, and as they continue up across the sky, they point down to a star that rises in the east, which is the brightest star in the sky, which is Sirius, the dog star. And so there's this basic correspondence between the story in Matthew's Gospel and what you can see in the sky. You've got three kings who, although of course they don't say three in the Bible, we just infer the three from the golden, frankincense, and myrrh. And as they come up, they see this star in the east. And now the question is, what's underneath the star in the east that could possibly correspond to the manger of Christ? And this is where I'm presenting this, what I find a really interesting hypothesis, which my view is that it hasn't really been understood because there's we're at the latitude of 31 degrees north, well south of the latitude of Europe and the US. So what we've got below, looking from the three kings past the star in the east, we have this constellation, which is Argo, the ship. And the interesting thing about Argo is, as I say, it's not visible from Europe. So the mythology that's associated with Argo is quite invisible to people in northern latitudes. So this ship, Argo, obviously the name Argo is very similar to Ark. And so there's a view that the Argo was the same as Noah's Ark. And we see this little constellation here, which is behind this. Unfortunately, it doesn't get a diagram in this software, but that is Columba, the dove. And so if I click on one of these stars here, we'll see Beta Columbae. That means Columba is the dove. And so this constellation here, Argo, what I find really interesting, Elliot, is to say, okay, is there anything in this constellation that could match to the whole story? And let's just consider the similarities between Jesus and Noah. Now, they were both mythological. Perhaps I know there's a big debate: was Jesus real or fake? But they were saviors of their people, and they were just like the ark, the ship in the sky, is made of wood, and it's got lots of animals. Same, Jesus was born in a wooden manger, surrounded by animals, and but the funny thing about this is that because all of these southern stars are invisible to people in the north, the interpretations of these stars were forgotten. And so that's why this conventional drawing, like we saw Orion and Sirius, the dog, and the rabbit, and so on, they're all reasonably well known in the north. But Argo was not known in the north. And so what happens is that what I'll do is I'll switch to this other picture, which shows it a bit better. Can you see this picture?
No, we're still on the same one.
Still on the same one. Okay, so I'll just change my sharing, and we'll go back to this this other one, which is here, and so we're back into the PowerPoint. And okay, so with this version, we can see here that the ship of the sky, it's like it's sitting on the southern horizon, and it doesn't look like an ancient ship, does it? It's a Portuguese galleon, because it was when the Portuguese sailed south of the equator that they rediscovered this constellation, and they made up that they knew it was meant to be a ship, but they didn't know what it was like. And so for me, growing up in Australia, I was reading this book called Stars of the Southern Heavens. So you can see that a slide of this old book. And in learning Argo, this star here, this star is Canopus, which is the second brightest star in the sky. And for us here in Australia, from Sirius down to Canopus, that's the best way to find the South Celestial Pole. Like you've got the Polaris marks the North Celestial Pole for people in the north. For us, it's Sirius and Canopus point down. If you keep going the same distance along that path, then you get the South Celestial Pole. So there's Canopus, and then you've got this star, this group here. The way I always thought of it was that Canopus was the prow of the ship. This was the keel, and this was these two were the mast. But somehow they got it round backwards, and they put Canopus at the poop deck of the Middle Ages ship. But as so my interest was, okay, here's Orion up here and Sirius. What is it in this region of the sky, the area below the star in the east, that could possibly correspond to the Bible story? And so my view was quite simply that this detailed group of stars was what the ancients thought of as the manger of Christ. And so if you look at the mythology, here's a story from Plutarch, in which he says that the vessel which the Greeks call Argo, in form like the ship of Osiris, has been set among the constellations in his honor. So what they're saying, what Plutarch is saying, is that actually this constellation Argo represents Osiris, and it's close to Orion and Sirius, which the Egyptians believe represent Horus and Isis. Now, this is quite different from our usual modern versions, in which you sometimes hear people saying that Osiris represents Orion, but here we see Plutarch telling us that Orion is the constellation of Horus, and Sirius is the constellation of Isis, and that it's this constellation, invisible to people in the north, which represents Osiris, the ship of the sky. And you can just imagine, here it is, we had the east over here. Here it is sitting on the south. Now you can just imagine, Elliot, this constellation in the south. If you were sailing on the Nile River, on part of the Nile River where it flows due north, then you have this ship constellation just sitting on the water, and it would be reflected exactly in the calm water of the Nile River, like the as above, so below mythology that we have. So what I'm interested in is the idea that this whole stellar dimension of the Bible story was just completely suppressed and forgotten. And I see that as entirely possible, because there was a really strong prejudice within Christianity against the stellar imagery that was such a big part of pagan religion. And so, if Christianity in its early folk traditions also had these stellar mythologies, which were just handed down orally rather than being written down, or if they did get written down, then they haven't survived. And it's to me, it's a very plausible way of explaining many of these details in the story. So just looking at the stars without all of the traditional constellations from Orion up here and Sirius, it's this group of stars here that I think is really interesting to think of as the manger. So with the head and foot of the manger, just with the baby inside, and with the three kings sitting at the head of the manger. So it's like the three stars of Orion had travelled across and were sitting at the head of the manger and worshipping the Christ. So that's my interpretation of the story, and I'm just happy to be able to share it with you. That's just a more detailed look at these stars that where I have just made up this. I've made up this story myself, but I think it's quite plausible that it's a story that was actually an ancient story, and it's one that it's like reconstructing how they saw it from their perspective. And yeah, just a few more of these pictures, but I'll stop the share if I can, and now I'll come back and yeah. So what's your impression of that, Elliot?
Yeah, there's been various explanations as to why it was a manger, because that seems a little bit odd, right?
Yep.
And yeah, so it's like you wonder what's going on there, if that's alluding to, like, I never thought to put the ark and the manger together like that. But yeah, I mean, does Matthew actually describe it as animals surrounding him? Or are we just kind of inferring that?
I think that the animal side of it might be from Luke. I need to check because I mix it up. The shepherds in the fields are from Luke, and the the kings from the east are from Matthew. But it's like there were these just popular stories. Like people would look up at the stars. That was the television of the ancient world, and they would just imagine stories. And so so much of that, because it's oral tradition, and because the politics is quite difficult, a lot of this sort of claiming that there was just like Hercules and Andromeda were imagined in the sky by the Greeks. All of the different cultures had their imagination of stories in the sky among the stars, and so many of those stories have been lost for one reason and another, with cultural change and politics, and over long periods of time. So this is my imagination of how the ancients thought of the story of the kings coming from the east across to the west, and seeing the bright star in the east, which of course Sirius is the brightest star in the sky, and then looking underneath the star in the east and saying, okay, well, we can see the manger with the king, so to say that this manger with the king has got a resonance, midrashic resonance with the old story of Noah's Ark. This whole idea that just as for Noah, the world was so evil, so God sent Noah as a savior figure. Same with Jesus. And as I was saying, the animals, but as you're pointing out, maybe the animal part of it came from Luke and wasn't included by Matthew. So it's like we've got fragments of different parts of a story. And so what I find really interesting is just putting ourselves in their shoes and just having a look at the sky exactly as they saw it, which is what we can do with our modern astronomy software. And, we can just see, well, what was it like? And, there's a lot of debate about, well, was Jesus born at Christmas or some other time of year? But I really like the whole Christmas story, because Christmas is the first day that the sun starts to move back towards the north after the solstice. So it really is the beginning of the year. It's the birth of the sun, as far as the northern hemisphere is concerned, and so. Whereas for us here in Australia, of course, Christmas is in the middle of summer. All very different. So to imagine, put ourselves in their position, and then just think, what are all of these? If we find ways that the stars can reflect the stories that we've got, then we can take a sort of forensic approach, and we can pull the fragments together, and we can start to reconstruct how they might have originally thought.
Yeah. It's, I've never thought with the whole Christophany with Noah's Ark to put those two together, but that it makes sense that I wonder where the whole apocalyptic thing came from within Christianity, because it doesn't really exist within Judaism. But you can think like Zoroastrianisms, they were really all about the stars, right? And astrology. So you would think, like, it's been guessed that the three Magi is a reference to Zoroastrianism, right? So
Yes.
that might, and we saw the star in the east, right? That's a astrological reference, right? And that you might see some similarities between this story and Noah's Ark, and kind of get an apocalyptic message from it, right? Just like as the world was destroyed with the flood, maybe destroyed again somehow. And Jesus is the Noah figure.
Yeah, and of course, the letter of Peter says it won't be water but fire next time. So that's the apocalyptic dimension. But it's like there's this image of the second coming, that the first coming of Jesus would be like a warning, and the second coming would coincide with the destruction of the earth by fire. So that's it's got an interesting parallel, of course, with our climate change and global warming situation. But
they might not be that far off, right?
Well, but there's no way that the ancients could have predicted any of that sort of stuff. But it's just interesting.
So it has to be true. It has to be divine, then, right? There's just no way.
No.
I'm just messing with it. Yeah.
I know. I just find it. It's a remarkable coincidence.
Yeah.
That we've got this meaning in the story, and so there's a whole lot of other dimensions of this Argo story that correspond to Noah's Ark. As I pointed out, there's Columba the dove, which is been released by Noah immediately above the constellation, and then there's although I'm not completely sure of how old the Columba constellation is, whether it's an ancient or a modern constellation, I don't know. But there's these really interesting stories from India, because they've got the same name of the constellation, Argo. They call it Agastya, which is just really similar to Argo. And so the Canopus, the bright star in Argo, is in India. It's called Agastya, and they've got this story about how Agastya migrated from Sri Lanka up to the north of India, and it corresponds with the slow shift of the stars by precession of the equinox. So there's all of these intriguing correspondences between the stars as we see them and the stories that we have, and a lot of that correspondence has been forgotten or denied. But I think it's quite a useful way to reconstruct what the possible original meaning of the stories would have been.
Yeah. And then so we have the three kings. We have was it like in antiquity people would equate uh, a boat with a manger, or was there some kind of equivalency there?
Well, there's nothing that's explicit in the literature, that, to my knowledge. Now, I showed you the story that Plutarch said that this boat in the sky was actually the boat of Osiris. And then, of course, with Osiris, there's the famous story of him getting stuck in a box. And and in his so there is actually, now that you ask the question, there is in the Egyptian tradition this correspondence between the box that Set stuck Osiris in and the boat of Osiris. So I think when they have the annual Osiris festival back in ancient Egypt, there was this correspondence between the boat of Osiris and the box that Osiris was stuck in. And so then you can start to say, well, a box is like a manger, and you've got this correspondence between Osiris and Jesus, bringing in this syncretism from different locations. Now, you also mentioned how the Magi came from the east, and of course that made them Chaldeans, Persians from Babylon. And the Chaldeans were renowned astrologers. So you've got this story of how and it doesn't say three kings, but the kings from the east, how they had seen the story of Jesus in the sky. So you've got all of these clues, and what I'm saying is that we should take these clues and just follow them up in a forensic sort of way, and say, what's the most plausible origin? Is there anything that we can see in the sky that corresponds to this literature that we've got? And the literature's been stripped of any sort of empirical content. So we've just got the mythology. I was reading the other day a survey that said that 90% of Americans believe that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And I was surprised at that, because the scholarship says that a lot of this birth narrative material is purely mythological. It's just fantasy stories that have been and we don't know why they made up these fantasy stories. And here what I'm suggesting is that it's quite possible that there was this sort of popular star myth that gave rise to the Nativity story. And but clearly, and there's more people who believe Jesus was born in Bethlehem than there are Christians in America. So it's a story that's just part of the popular consciousness. No one sort of dreams that it might be fictional, except the scholars. But then the Christian scholars, they don't sort of then take the next step and say, okay, well, if this one's fiction, doesn't that suggest that maybe even more of it is fiction? Since there's no corroboration of the broader story, it makes sense that the whole story has some sort of fictional intent about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to the point that most people think that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, that's what all the stories say. So, I mean, it makes sense to think that, well, I mean, what reason do they have to make that up, right? But, I mean, It was
Well, I'll give you one of the problems.
yeah.
Like I'm a church guy. I like Christianity, even though I think it's all fiction. But 1 week we had the story of the massacre of the innocents. So the story the one that I read out just what happens next is they go back to Herod and they say, we found the king, and Herod says, oh, where's he live? I want to come and worship him too. And they say they work out that he wasn't exactly being 100% on truthful there, and then they flee to Egypt, and he massacres all of the infant boys of Bethlehem. But in Luke, which was the story that we had in church the very next week, as soon as Jesus was born, he gets taken back to Nazareth and then is presented in the temple in Jerusalem when he's 30 days old. And I think, oh, well, this would have been a good opportunity for Herod to chop his head off. But so we've got Matthew saying he's in Egypt, and we've got Luke saying he's being presented in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the way the apologists get around that they say, oh, well, actually the Magi didn't come until he was 6 months old. He was presented in the temple, and then the whole refugee story of him fleeing to Egypt all happened when he was older. But that doesn't correspond with Matthew. We read the story. I read the story at the start, and it's very clear that it's when Jesus was a baby that they came, or let alone the whole popular mythology where you've got the nativity scene with the three kings plus the shepherds all together. So there's just blatant contradictions within the stories, which indicates that they're fictional, but the point of these stories isn't to know what really happened. It's to say, well, what does it mean for us? And what I'm saying is that the way they were looking at it was, how do we connect our world to the stability and perfection of the cosmos? We can see the eternal stars are always the same, and so if we imagine this as above, so below sort of cosmology, saying, we can imagine repairing our world to make it perfect like the stars. That's the sort of moral message that comes out of the nativity story, rather than all of this miraculous stuff about the virgin birth.
Yeah. And you might imagine Virgo, right, being associated with it. And you wonder if there's not a reason, because I've always thought of it as three Magi, right?
Yeah, that's the tradition. Everyone grows up with it. Yeah, you
wonder if there's any meaning with the three gifts, and it doesn't say three Magi, so the stars represent the three gifts.
But if it represents the belt of Orion with the three stars, then it's like that was the popular story, and they only alluded it. They stripped out the direct explanation in order to prevent the story being suppressed. And this is a method, a heuristic that I think is quite common in the New Testament. And it's something that was quite explicit in Indian mythology, where they said in the Vedic myths they had two versions. They had a popular version for the general public, and which was taught to children, and they had a secret version which was held by the esoteric initiated religious elites, and so this question of this idea that, well, actually the three kings were represent the belt of Orion. It's the sort of thing that would have been kept as a secret, as a mystery, and it would have only been people would have only heard about it when they grew up and were initiated, and it wasn't the sort of thing that got written down, because all of the culture, all of religious culture, was completely oral in those days, and the rise of writing then really distorted and transformed religious traditions, because people had prodigious feats of memory. The whole, like, my view is that the whole of the Old Testament was handed on by memory with these. The method that they used was that, and this is something that was universal across the world in pre-literate cultures, that that initiated elders would recite the story together, and by reciting it together, they made sure that they didn't forget it, and they didn't get it wrong, and they didn't change it. And then when writing came along, they had the opportunity to set it down. But what happened was that in setting it down in writing, it exposed them to the vulnerability of people coming along and saying, okay, this written version, that's the literal truth, and all of this old stuff about it just being an allegory for some moral message, well, that's all rubbish. Well, let alone a cosmic message, because they wanted to get rid of all of this cosmic stuff, because they wanted to say, God is supernatural, and this sort of saying that all the stories, it's just an allegory for what we can see in the sky, that it's like it detracts from the grandeur of the idea that God is supernatural. So they loved this supernatural version, especially because that reinforced the power of the king, and it reinforced this idea of a hierarchical, patriarchal, monotheistic culture. Whereas this sort of stellar stuff, it's very polytheistic, very eclectic, and so they just wanted to get rid of it.
Yeah, and that kind of says something, like when you have a religion that's more experiential, more tradition, right? And there's only so much you can capture on paper, right? And it kind of lends for itself to be taken literally, where normally, I guess, or it might not make sense to take it literally, right? Like Mark, Jesus taught in parables, right? So you would think, like, not necessarily to take this as literal, but as, maybe one giant parable, right?
Exactly.
Because it's not meant
Well,
for.
it's in all of the synoptics where Jesus says, everything I say to the general public is a parable, and I reserve the secrets of the kingdom for the initiates, or for the disciples.
Yeah, and even in John, they say it where, what is it? I'm paraphrasing. I don't want everybody to understand, or else they would receive me by faith and understand and be healed.
Yeah, that's a pretty weird line.
Yeah, and what you wonder, why wouldn't you want everybody to be healed, and why wouldn't you want everybody to understand? But maybe there's like a hint that we're in the secret club, right? That we're the wise people, and we know the things like astrology or whatnot. You wonder. I don't know. Do you have any guess as to? Do you think they're alluding to something with the whole secrecy thing?
Well, the way I see it, as I was saying, is that let's see, saying that just the literal version is the authorized dogma, and that everything else is heresy. It's that is a line that reinforces a very hierarchical, authoritarian version of religion, because it means that the king can say, he's got his authorized priest, who's the only one who's allowed to interpret God, and everyone else, they're not allowed to have any interpretation that conflicts with what the king's priest says. And so that subordinates religion to politics through the unification of church and state, throne and altar in the old tradition. And it means that you can use religion as a force for imperial stability, because it's what Constantine then came along and did was he said, okay, we've had enough of all of this religious dispute, and we're not having any more of that. And anyone who disagrees with our line, we'll just kill them. And so we're going to have one religion, and that's the only one that's allowed. So as part of that setting up of one religion, they saw things like this sort of tradition where, imagining Jesus in the stars, and said, no, that doesn't fit. We'll get rid of that. And so what they said, this is the edict of Theodosius in the fairly soon after Constantine. He said, okay, if you've got anything that promotes anything that's contrary to our orthodoxy, then we'll kill you. And if you've got any literature, then we'll burn it. So that was the policy for the next 1,000 years. And when you've got that sort of policy, it's pretty easy to see how if somebody had written down, this story of actually the three kings of the belt of Orion, a priest a monk is looking at his library, and he comes upon this book, and it says, the three kings aren't actually three kings, they're stars in the sky. He says, okay, if I get caught with this, I'm dead. Just burn it, or just toss it out in the rubbish, let it rot. So you've got this syndrome of the destruction. And my view is that if we imagine the ancient world as like a rich rainforest, with ancient ecosystems, deep complexity, then the Roman Empire was like a big chainsaw, and it just chopped it all down, and it turned it into a barren field. And then people come along and they say, oh, this barren field's been here forever. There's no evidence here of a rainforest. and so it's really hard but then the archaeologists start to come and dig in the field, and they find all of this evidence. And that's what I find with this story of Matthew. It's like evidence that they had a much more complex, rich cultural tradition about the meaning of these stories and the observation of the stars, and that we can start to reconstruct what the possible observations of the stars were that lie behind these, simplistic supernatural stories that we've got in the Bible.
Yeah. And that's a good metaphor for it, that you think of Rome as just like clear cutting everything, right? And everything's very literal, right? And that's a good way to put how they were, that like even their mythology, it's almost like they took the Greek mythology and they're just like portraits of gods that like, this is the god that does this. There's not really the same stories as Greek mythology, right? That it's a bit more simplified, right? But then, with Christianity coming, clear cut everything, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, like the original Christianity, I would say, was much more complex and nuanced and rich and deep in its traditions, but it got turned into something that would support the empire. And one of the old sayings about the Roman Empire was that they made a desert and called it peace. So that was like a lot of our propaganda has the glory of Rome and so on, that of admiring the Roman Empire, whereas I tend to think of the Roman Empire as a really very brutal and even evil operation, and not something really to be admired. And similarly, we can take that sort of model in our world today. With our modern empires, we just need to be much more inclusive towards different cultures, and just honoring different cultural heritage rather than just saying, everything's part of, one big empire where everyone has to be the same, monolithic and uniform.
Yeah. So with Christian origins, right, so you said that there's probably a lot more diversity early on.
That's right.
Now,
Yeah.
do you have any ideas? But like, it's a big thing for me, Christian origins. How do you think it came about? Are you kind of on the lines of Second Temple Judaism, or is it like?
Well, I think that there was a lot more interaction between all of the different cultures. So after the Hellenistic invasion, so Alexander 330 BC brought together Greece, Persia, Syria, Egypt, Israel, and also as far as India. And so, and then in the second century BC, Ashoka, the emperor of India, unified the whole Indian continent nearly as a Buddhist empire, and he sent Buddhist missionaries from India to Egypt and Greece and Israel. And there's still lots of records of those. And my view is that the temple, the therapeutes of Alexandria, were actually founded as a Buddhist monastery, because the really interesting thing about the monastic tradition is that they had monasteries in India for 1,000 years before Christ, but there's no record of any monasteries in the Mediterranean before then. So the whole concept of monasticism was an import from India to the Mediterranean, and that's not. I haven't seen any detailed studies of that, but it's a interpretation that just makes. I've been looking for any literature on it, but I haven't found. How did monasticism, and it's because there's a lot of prejudice against Buddhism in the West, which I don't really understand. I think that there's such deep wisdom within Buddhism, and there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the profound ethical ideas within Christianity, ideas about peace and love and truth, actually came from Buddhist India. And similarly, that like with the three kings coming from Persia, you've got this profound, astral tradition, which was just all thrown into the mix. And then with Jesus going with his mum and dad to Egypt, that's like a signal of saying that we're going to draw in the traditions of Egypt too. And I've mentioned the interesting correspondence between Osiris and Jesus, and that's another one that I find it really distressing, actually, that there's such hostility to these sorts of ideas, because what you get is people who are scientifically minded. They just say, well, all of this stuff it reminds us too much of astrology and magic and all of these things that we don't, that are disreputable, and we don't want to be associated with those disreputable traditions, so we're just going to diss it all. And so I feel like there's a problem of method, and we've got this split between people who are sort of open to these more esoteric lost traditions. The trouble is that then people go overboard with Atlantis and aliens and all of this Edgar Cayce sort of imagination. And so I think it's really interesting to try to find a middle way that says, okay, there's so much in the rich forest of biodiversity of the ancient world that we don't know and that's been lost, and that we can find some clues for in what has survived, even though the details aren't there. But we ought to be able to try and reconstruct what it was possibly like, and that'll really help us in understanding Christian origins.
Yeah, I've heard that before with monasticism being a Buddhist thing, and Buddhism coming into the mix, and just like Dr. MacDonald, he talks about the epics, right, playing a role in the stories, and then we have astrotheology. It's just it's very syncretic.
Well, so like, for example, there was the 19th century English scholar Gerald Massey, who has a very poor reputation these days, but he was really honoured as a key writer by Acharya S in the Christ Conspiracy, and because he went through all of the similarities between Egyptian mythology and Christian mythology, and he found that there were numerous points of contact. Now, it might be that he got some of them wrong, but there are so many of these points of contact that I think it's a really compelling story that the gospel, that the communities who wrote the gospel were bringing in ideas from everywhere. From Buddhism, from Egypt, from Chaldeans, from Greece. Like, I think Plato's Republic was another big template for the Christian story, with Jesus like a philosopher king. And we've got Dennis MacDonald, as you mentioned, how much the Gospels used the story of Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, as the Odyssey especially. I think it's like everyone in those days knew the Odyssey story, and they knew that it was a great drama, and they wanted to have their own drama, which was just as good. So using it as a template, it actually makes a lot of sense as a way of generating a story that's going to really work as a popular story.
Yeah.
So finding this sort of gospel in the stars, we can then see all of these similar sorts of examples, including from Egypt.
And it's interesting to see that, like similar to Mithraism, right? We have the Trochthony in the sky, right? The bull, Perseus slaying the bull. And you wonder if that isn't like one of the main inspirations for the Gospels, is maybe we're reinventing earlier stories, right? Or we're just looking at the sky, seeing the stars. But
one of the big things about this, looking at the stars, is this distinction that we've got in modern Christianity between heaven and the heavens. And that's not something that would have occurred to the ancients, because they just saw the visible heavens looking up to the stars as the abode of God. And the thing is that the stars, apart from the planets, they're just permanently in place. So they are like the symbol of permanent order and stability and perfection. And so you've got this as above, this the heavens. And so when the Lord's Prayer says, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," it's like saying, well, we can see the divine perfection of the stars, and we can see the hopeless chaos that we've got on earth, and we'd love to just have the same sort of orderly world here that we can see in the sky. And so we'd like to imagine what we can do to transform our world thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's something that's much that has got much more of a practical meaning about transforming the politics of earth, rather than the way the church just turned it into such a supernatural story.
Yeah, and it's very Platonic, isn't it? With like Timaeus, they're talking about the sphere of the fixed stars, right, and the creation of the earth, and it's good, and it's necessarily good because the craftsman or demiurge is good, right? Which is, I think, where we kind of get Genesis from. And and just creating it from a blueprint that is perfectly good, and then he creates the earth, and it's like you can kind of see spheres within spheres, right? So you're kind of looking at the inside of you're inside a ball, right, with the stars rotating around you. I think that's what the Platonic view was. And right beyond that is like the domain of the gods, right? Or I mean, maybe a higher plane. And
Sure. Well, in Timaeus, and of course, Timaeus gets a mention in the Bible where the blind beggar is Jesus gives his sight back to, is called the son of Timaeus, Bartimaeus, and so this idea of Jesus being able to restore the sight of Timaeus is a very clear allusion to that Platonic model. And so what the Timaeus, the key idea in Timaeus, is that you've got a Chi-Rho cross in the sky, which is formed by the intersection of the path of the sun and the celestial equator. And so he says that that's the basis of all identity and difference, which are key ideas in philosophy. So the path of the stars is always the same, but the path of the sun is changing, and so what that suggests is that as they looked at how that Chi-Rho cross in the sky was moving, that they could actually see the precession of the equinox, and that provided the astronomical model for the story of Jesus. And this is another key representation of Jesus in the sky, because by the time the cross, so you've got this Chi cross formed by the path of the sun and the celestial equator, and by the time that reached the constellation of Pisces, it was like it was imagined as a new age, and they could see that coming for centuries or thousands of years beforehand. But all of this material was not conducive to the sort of simplistic, neutered Christianity that the Roman Empire wanted. And so for that reason, it's the only clues that we have are very fragmentary. There's nothing explicit. Like basically anything that dealt with this material in an explicit way would have just been tossed out and not allowed to censored. So there's, I think, the other Platonic dimension that I find really interesting is the Republic, and because you've got this idea of the sun as the image of perfection in Plato's Republic. You've got the story of the cave, where people are deluded by images and need to turn around and see the truth, and the idea of the good, that we're currently deluded by false beliefs, but through philosophy we can learn the truth, and that truth will then enable us to build an ethical society. And so the way I see it is that when the Greeks invaded the Hellenistic Empire, created the Hellenistic empires, they brought Platonic philosophy, and so they brought people like Euclid. He was in Alexandria. Greek geometry came out of Alexandria, and Ptolemy. Greek astronomy came out of Alexandria too. So you had this whole Greek diaspora, and so similarly you had this whole Greek philosophical tradition, and when they went to Egypt, and they found that the Egyptians were worshipping gods with animal heads, and they couldn't cope with that, so they made up the religion of Serapis, and quite deliberately they said, we're going to mix Osiris with Zeus, and we're going to have Serapis, and he's a totally astrological deity. And then, but the same thing was happening in Babylon. That they mixed together their Greek stories with the Mithraic traditions of sun worship out of Zoroastrianism, and they got Mithras. So it's this syncretism. And similarly in Israel, that they mixed together their Greek philosophy, Plato's Republic, and so on, with the Old Testament, and they got Jesus Christ. And so there's and then so basically you then had these three, just like you had the three Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and so on, and so too you had the three gods who went with them, Jesus, Mithras, and Serapis, and they were duking it out, and Jesus won the fight, and so that's my broad view. But so from on high you had this need of the Hellenistic empires for a modus vivendi, a middle way that would enable them to have a religion in these lands that they had conquered. But then you also had Buddhists coming in and saying, look, we've got this fantastic ancient ethical tradition. How about that? And, so everything was in the big melting pot. And the integral result coming out the other end was the Gospels.
Yeah, and just weaving all the different traditions into the Gospels, right? That it's just so wild how you can kind of take different levels of meaning to it, right? And you
That's
can
right.
look and see the same stories being told, but with a certain twist to it, right? Which is, so it's saying a little bit slightly different thing, right? And like,
yeah. Well, just like Noah's Ark was based on the Gilgamesh story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So I just had another point I was going to make, but it'll come back to me.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of inclined to agree with the syncretism as an explanation for Christian origins, where I kind of see like a little bit of Mandaism, right, with the whole baptism as an important thing, right? With, they say John the Baptist was involved with Mandaism, and then the whole, how they have the plus symbol with the cloth around it in Mandaism. I wonder if that's how we didn't get the cross in Christianity. And Zoroastrianism is another one, right? Where that's how we get a bit of apocalypticism. Might be where Judaism got messianism, right? Where they have their own messianic figure that he has to be a descendant of Zoroaster, right? And he's to come and bring about, a great world and judge and like raise everybody from the dead and judge them just like Christ will, right? So it's kind of like a mixing a little bit of everything together.
We got a question from Lauren about the 3 days in the underworld, and I find that a really interesting story there, and it's got several dimensions to it, and the key one is the solar dimension of the solstice, which is that when the sun dies at the end of the year on the shortest day, then it appears to not move for 3 days. And so the modern astronomy has calculated the difference, and it's like between December 22nd and 23rd, the difference in the length of the day is about 1 second, and then the 24th it's about 5 seconds longer, and then it starts. So it's a detectable, like you can see where you can measure the point, and this is what places like Stonehenge did and so on, and also, of course, all of the Egyptian temples. You can measure the exact point of the solstice, so you can calculate when is the first day on which the sun is reborn, which of course is Christmas. And so you've got this idea, and then the transposing of that Christmas solstice story onto the Easter equinox is what's so interesting, because you've got this myth of the death and rebirth of the sun in the annual cycle, and that's like the cycle of light. That the darkest day is the winter solstice, and the days start to become more light after that. But then you've also got what we can call the cycle of life. So we've got two versions of the year. Well, actually, three versions of the year. We've got the version of the year based on starting at the solstice, which is the first, which is like Christmas is the first day of the new year, in terms of that cycle of light. Then we've got our calendar year starting on the 1st of January. But then we've also got the natural year, which is starting at the spring equinox. And this is like the idea that in the cycle of life, that spring is the beginning of new life, and the new life each year begins in spring and flowers in summer, and starts and declines in fall, and then goes dormant in the winter at the end of the year. So there is this old tradition of the equinox, or Easter, or Passover, as the first month of the year, and so it's like, again, this mixing of the solstice observation of the sun standing still for 3 days, and then Jesus spending 3 days in hell. Although, of course, that's got a whole lot of ambiguity, because it's actually 40 hours that Jesus spends in hell between dying on the cross and getting raised from the dead on Easter Sunday. And
is the harrowing of hell, is that in the Gospels, or the canonical Gospels?
No, the harrowing of hell is a later myth, apparently, but we never know with these stories what their real origin was, because if the story was transmitted as a secret oral mystery, then it could go back. Who knows how far back it went? This is where I feel that a lot of the Christian mythology could actually be far older than we realize, in a mythological framework, and it was only sort of put into its explicit historical form by St. Mark, and that he wasn't just sort of making it up whole cloth. He was pulling together stories that had a massive tradition, and it was in the context of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that they had to use their religion as a weapon to undermine the legitimacy of the Roman Empire, and so come out with this story of, well, hey, all of our myths are actually historically true. So I would say that the harrowing of hell could be a very ancient story, and so because look at Stonehenge, that goes back many thousands of years and the Egyptian temples, that celebrate the solstice. The idea of the solstice and the equinox as the basis of the calendar is a really basic thing for an agrarian society. You have to know when to sow and when to reap. So Lawrence also mentioned the Katha Upanishad. The boy is sacrificed by his father and spends 3 days in the jaws of death, then returns. And this thanks, Lauren, but this illustrates how this motif of 3 days is something that has got the broader cultural resonance. What I might try and do is share screen again and give you another one of my versions of this. So I'll go back to Skygazer, and I love just studying this stuff, because what we can do is we can find here the ecliptic. Okay, so there's the path of there's Leo, Cancer, Gemini, and if we keep going, I'm having trouble moving this. It's if we keep moving it across to find this spot here, which is the equinox. What I've done is I've got a display in which I need to just change the display by working out how I can. No, okay. I'm going to have a bit of difficulty with this, but I'll just go to another of these Skygazer charts that I've made with this software, and what we've got is there's lots of these stories in the sky, but the one that I'm after is 21 AD, and what this shows is, and what I've done is I've zoomed right in, so it'll just take me a while to get this back. So just bear with me while I zoom out, because what I've done is I've zoomed right in order to find the point of the equinox at the time of Christ. This was on the 15th of September 21 AD, when the equinox crossed the first fish of Pisces. Now, what we've got here is if we look at the movement, then we can see we're going back in time into BC. Where this is the movement of the equinox point through the age of Pisces. So that in 0 AD it was there. Here we've reached 600 AD, and we're moving up along the second fish of Pisces, and we can see the date racing forward. We're at 1000 AD, and we're coming up to the current position very soon. But you'll see down here, this is Cetus, the whale, and it's quite interesting that Cetus is located so close to the equinox point, and what that suggests to me is that the story of Jonah has got a very interesting correspondence with the Jesus story. Just this whole idea of Jesus as somehow marking the equinox point, and so the 3 days story obviously goes back to Jonah spending 3 days in the belly of the whale, and so imagining this Jonah story in the sky, Cetus the whale is the obvious one. Now we haven't got any details of how they told the story of Jonah, in the sky, but finding it right next to Pisces the fish, and Aries the ram. It's you can just sort of start to imagine how some of these quite cryptic stories that we've got in the Gospels about Jesus being just like a new Jonah and spending 3 days in the earth would make sense.
Yeah, it almost makes me want to take a look at that app and see what I can see in relation to different stories.
Exactly, and there's so many interesting ones, like because you've got Pisces and Virgo. You mentioned Virgo earlier, and of course, what was happening as the equinox moved into Pisces, the spring equinox, the autumn equinox at the same time was moving into Virgo, and so you've got this, and Virgo, the main star is Spica, the ear of wheat. So you've got the symbolism of the loaves and fishes as marking the new age, Virgo and Pisces, as the equinoxes move in. So there's a very clear correlation between the mythology in the New Testament, and here I'm talking about the feeding of the multitude, and this vision of the stars as the procession marking a new age in an apocalyptic sense. And so I think that there's these sorts of stories have quite a speculative quality, but to my approach, it's a more meaningful and plausible way of reading it in a constructive way, certainly than any of the literalism, because I view literalism as an evil, deluded corruption. That it's something that was instituted by the Roman Empire in order to serve their imperial interests. And it's still the case today that that literalism, it only serves the interests of the powerful. It doesn't serve the message of the gospel, which is about social transformation. And and the reason that came about was that as I said before, the Roman Empire wanted a single story that they could use for imperial stability, so they had to neuter all of the politics out of it. And so, all this idea about, the whole point of it is going to heaven after you die, and that Jesus was supernatural, and God's supernatural. All of these stories, they're designed to remove the radical politics out of religion, and whereas that message of liberation is something that's really key to the Gospels. And I think by putting it back into a natural ethical framework, we can restore some of that transformative message in the Gospels.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that works. Where normally when we kind of study Christianity, after a bit, maybe if we came from a conservative background, right, where it looks like a whole bunch of nonsense after that, right? Well, it's all made up. But when you look at it as it's not meant to be taken literally, right, that it's meant to be something different, like figurative, poetic, whatever you want to say, or it's commentary on society,
Allegorical parables, mythology.
Then it becomes relevant again.
Yeah, and reconstructing that relevance, I think, is really important for our world today, because we've got this a severe problem of climate change, where the powerful elites see inequality as their thing, and they see action on climate change as a threat to their wealth, and so there's just a whole distortion, of the science that's out there in the public. And whereas I'm saying, let's just put the scientific principles of evidence and logic as our foremost moral principles, and that then we can interpret the Bible through that. And it's a big shock to people to say, "Oh, Jesus was a myth. Jesus was fiction," and it was all fiction from the start. And the idea that it was true was a conspiracy of the Roman Empire. That the Roman Empire said, what we need is a story that will serve our imperial interests. So we're going to pay bishops who are going to say, everything that supports the empire is dogma, and everything that opposes the empire is heresy. and that was the basic criterion. They said that they wanted to have a story that served imperial stability, and so that's what the whole orthodox idea of going to heaven after you're dead. It's you don't transform this earth. You wait until you're gone to heaven for to achieve any benefits of Christianity. But because the empire had such power and was able to co-opt everyone into its diluted message, that whole line of interpretation just became normalized, and people got to the point where they couldn't even imagine anything else and thought, anything else is just crazy. Whereas, it just shows how severely diluted our world is. We're on a pathway to destruction. It's like, the way is broad and easy to destruction, and it's narrow and hard to salvation. And I think that narrow, hard salvation is a scientific path. It's about what does the evidence actually say? What is a coherent story that where our morals cohere with the evidence of our senses.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so yeah, I mean that's a good spot to end on. Is there any other thoughts that you wanted to say before we go?
Look, I'll just conclude again and say that there's such beautiful stories in the gospel and the whole Bible. I think one of the most wonderful stellar stories is the tree of life, where you've got this idea of a tree that's got 6 fruit, that's got a river running through it. So the tree's growing on both sides of the river, and it's got 12 fruits, one for each month. And it's an actual direct correlation with the relationship between the 12 constellations of the zodiac, and the celestial river of the Milky Way. You've got the 6 fruit on either side of the Milky Way. And the interesting thing in the Bible is it says back in the Golden Age, when the earth was in a state of harmony and grace, we were living with the tree of life. Then Adam and Eve got booted out of the Garden of Eden, booted out of paradise, and separated from the tree of life, and that the restoration of the world is the restoration of contact. This is in the very last chapter of the Bible. That it's the restoration of the contact with the tree of life that is the symbol of salvation. And so it's a deeply natural story. It's saying that our human psychology, our dominant historical ideologies are alienated from nature. And we need to reconcile our thinking with our nature. Culture and nature need to be brought back together. This idea of spirit as separate from and above nature is an evil falsehood. And but it's one that has come to somehow dominate Christendom, and it reflects the fallen nature of Christendom, that these sorts of interpretations are so distant from the current dominant religious thinking.
Yeah, very good.
So thank you very much, Elliot. Really appreciate chatting with you. I think you're doing some fantastic work here, and I really admire your work, and really pleased to be able to chat. And I think this story about Argo as the manger is what that we started with, and Sirius is the star of the east. There's it presents a very plausible analysis, and one that I'd really like to be able to share more widely. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on, and yeah, thank you everybody for watching, and have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Okay, bye.